Frank sat in his worn recliner, the soft hum of the old TV filling the quiet room. The factory whistle outside had long stopped calling him back, and now his days felt stretched thin, like fading notes of a forgotten song. He stared at the screen where Elon Musk was unveiling a humanoid robot designed to replace millions of manual labor jobs. Frank's heart sank. That means me, he thought, his hands trembling slightly. For decades, he had been the backbone of the local manufacturing plant in Ohio, the steady hands that kept the machines running. Now, those same machines were about to be outdone by a metal stranger, soulless and tireless. The news anchor's voice felt distant, like a storm passing over, but inside Frank's chest, a tempest raged. Was he about to become obsolete? What if everything you believed about your worth was about to be challenged? Elon's voice from a clip echoed in his mind. Frank clenched his fists. The robot was sleek, fast, and tireless, a symbol of progress, but also a stark reminder that time was no longer his ally. The TV flashed images of factories filled with these new workers of steel, replacing thousands of jobs just like his. He looked around his modest living room, the peeling wallpaper, the faded family photos, the dusty bookshelf with half-read novels, and wondered where he fit into this new world. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning, Elon had said during a live stream Frank had stumbled onto earlier. Frank's fingers hovered over the keyboard of his old laptop. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The live stream host asked. Frank's mind wandered to the worn typewriter collecting dust in the attic, a relic from another time, a symbol of dreams he'd set aside decades ago. Outside, the wind rattled the windowpane, whispering change was coming, whether he was ready or not. The thought of telling his daughter Susan, who had long moved to a city far away, about the robot filled him with dread. Would she understand? Would she even care? Frank's body ached from years of labor, but his spirit ached more from feeling invisible, like the slow erosion of his own relevance. That night, as the house settled into silence, Frank lay awake, the robot's cold metallic eyes haunting his dreams. Was this the moment it all changed, the moment he stopped being needed? Or was it the spark that would light a fire inside him, a fire he thought had long gone out? Frank's life before the shift was like a well-worn novel, pages filled with hard work, quiet sacrifices, and dreams that slowly faded into the background. Born and raised in a small Ohio town, he had learned early the value of a steady paycheck and the pride that came from honest labor. For 40 years, the factory was his world, the clanging of machines, the rhythmic pulse of the assembly line, the smell of grease and metal that clung to his clothes. Every morning he put on his worn work boots, kissed his wife Mary goodbye, and headed to the plant, knowing he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. Yet beneath the surface of routine and responsibility, there had always been a flicker of something else, a longing to write, to tell stories from his heart. As a young man, Frank dreamed of becoming a novelist, his mind alive with characters and plots that took him far beyond the industrial streets of his hometown. But life had other plans. There was the mortgage to pay, the kids to raise, and the constant pressure to keep going, to provide. So the typewriter he once cherished was boxed away, gathering dust in the attic alongside old photographs and forgotten letters. Frank's wife, Mary, had been his rock until she passed away 5 years ago, leaving behind a silence that filled the house like a shadow. Their daughter, Susan, had moved to Chicago after college, chasing her own dreams. The distance between them had grown, not just miles but in spirit, as Frank's world grew smaller and quieter. He remembered the last time Susan visited, her eyes full of pity as she told him, "Dad, maybe it's time to think about slowing down." Those words had stung more than any physical ache. Frank wanted to shout back, to tell her he was still here, still fighting, but instead he nodded and looked away. He carried regrets like old scars, the business he never started, the stories he never wrote, the moments he lost to doubt and fear. There was the afternoon when he let anger push away his best friend Joe, now a stranger. There was the birthday he missed, the phone calls he didn't make. The weight of these memories pressed on him, a reminder of time slipping through his fingers like sand. Yet there was one memory that stood above the rest, a symbol of the man Frank once was and the man he longed to be again. It was a summer evening when Mary had surprised him with a typewriter, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon. "It's never too late," she had whispered, her eyes shining with hope. Frank had smiled, touched by her faith, but the fear of failure had held him back. Now, years later, that typewriter sat silent, a ghost of possibilities unfulfilled. Frank's days blended into one another, morning walks to the mailbox, watching the neighborhood children play, and evenings spent flipping through the faded pages of a worn Bible Mary had gifted him on their wedding day. Loneliness was a quiet companion, settling deep into his bones. Sometimes, he caught himself staring at the calendar, counting down days until retirement, until the factory closed its doors, until the robot inevitably took his place. His body was beginning to betray him too, the stiff joints, the sharp pains in his back, the doctor's gentle warnings to take it easy. Yet Frank resisted. He was not ready to fade away into nothingness, to become a forgotten face in a town that had forgotten him. That fear of invisibility was his driving force, the ember smoldering beneath his exhaustion. The factory had been more than a job, it was a community, a family, a source of pride. Now, with Elon Musk's announcement flashing on the news, that world felt like it was crumbling beneath his feet. Frank's mind drifted back to that day when he first heard about Tesla's electric cars, the rockets, the Mars missions, things that felt so far removed from his life. Elon Musk was a name whispered with awe and disbelief, a man who seemed to defy limits and rewrite what was possible. Frank wondered if someone like Elon ever felt fear or doubt, or if he was simply made of different stuff. The more Frank thought about it, the more the robot symbolized something deeper than just lost jobs. It was a mirror reflecting his own fears about aging, about being left behind in a world that prized youth and innovation above experience and wisdom. But somewhere in that fear was a faint pulse of curiosity, a small voice whispering, "What if this is not the end, but the beginning?" Frank's memories were vivid, like old movie reels playing behind his eyes, the laughter of his children running through the yard, Mary's gentle touch on his arm, the scent of fresh coffee in the mornings. These images gave him strength, but they also reminded him of all he had let slip away. He longed for a second chance, a moment to reclaim the dreams he buried beneath years of survival. As he sat in his living room that evening, the TV flickering softly, Frank made a quiet promise to himself. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for permission to matter again. Maybe it was time to believe, like Elon Musk said, that age was just a number, and that the real limit was the mindset. The night deepened, and with it, a sense of restless determination took root in Frank's heart. He could not undo the past, but perhaps he could still shape the future. And with that thought, the story of a man who once felt forgotten began to rewrite itself, one small step at a time. Frank woke to the soft buzzing of his phone on the nightstand, the glow illuminating the dark room. A message from Susan. He hesitated before opening it, the familiar sting of doubt creeping in. They had been distant for years, their conversation sparse and strained. "Dad, maybe you should think about slowing down. The doctor said it's time to take it easy." Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of how little she understood the man he still was beneath the aches and wrinkles. Was it really time to slow down? Was he too old to chase anything new? Those questions gnawed at him like persistent shadows. Downstairs, the television played a muted news report about the factory's future, the words, automation, and robot replacement, punctuating the silence like nails in a coffin. Frank felt the walls close in, the weight of invisibility pressing hard. He thought about the doctor's visit last week, the gentle but firm warning to consider retirement, the careful eyes that saw not the man but the worn body. Frank wrestled with a storm of emotions, anger at being dismissed, fear of being useless, sadness for the years slipping by. Society seemed to have boxed him into a category labeled too old, and the label felt like a noose tightening around his dreams. Yet amid the turmoil, a spark flickered. While scrolling through his phone to distract himself, Frank stumbled on a podcast featuring Elon Musk. The headline caught his eye, "Why Age is No Barrier to Innovation." Elon's voice was calm yet electric, full of conviction. Age is just a number. The real limit is your mindset, Elon said, the word striking a chord deep within Frank. Elon talked about failure, risk, and the relentless pursuit of change, no matter the obstacles. He described how he started new ventures when others told him it was impossible, how setbacks fueled rather than defeated him. For a moment, Frank felt as if Elon was speaking directly to him, challenging his quiet resignation. Could he reshape his story, even now? The podcast ended, but the fire it ignited in Frank's chest burned bright. He found himself looking around his house differently, the dust on the typewriter, the unopened journals, the old photos of a younger man full of promise. But just as hope began to seep in, reality hit hard. Susan's next message was more curt, "Dad, you need to accept that things change. You can't fight this forever." The words felt like a door slammed shut. Frank knew his daughter wanted to protect him, but her dismissal cut deep. He realized his battle wasn't just with time or technology, it was with those closest to him who had already written him off. At the factory, things were tense. Rumors of layoffs swirled like a thick fog, and Frank overheard coworkers whispering about who might be next. The boss's voice over the loudspeaker sounded distant and cold, "We're evolving to stay competitive. Change is inevitable." Frank clenched his fists, the words stinging like betrayal. The place that had given him purpose now seemed to spit him out. At night, Frank lay awake, haunted by questions. Is it too late to start over? Does anyone really care? What's the point if the world is moving on without me? The internal war raged between despair and defiance. He wanted to surrender but couldn't find the strength. The next morning, Frank made a small but deliberate choice. He pulled out the dusty typewriter from the attic, wiped off the thick layer of neglect, and set it on the kitchen table. His fingers trembled as he loaded a fresh sheet of paper, the clack of the keys breaking the silence like a heartbeat. The words came slowly at first, awkward and uncertain, but with every line, his confidence grew. He wrote about the factory, the people, the years of sweat and dreams deferred. He wrote to remember who he was and who he still wanted to be. That night, as he reread the pages, Frank felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Elon Musk's voice echoed in his mind, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." The odds were stacked high against him, but maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't over. Over the following days, Frank faced new tests. Susan's skepticism remained a cold barrier, the doctor's warnings grew sterner, and the factory's closure loomed closer. His body protested with aches and fatigue, but his mind was restless, refusing to settle into defeat. One evening, Susan surprised him with a short phone call. Her voice was hesitant, softer than before. "I read some of your writing. It's good, Dad. Maybe you're not as lost as I thought." The small bridge of connection sparked a fragile hope. Frank realized the battle was far from over, but this moment of breakthrough was a start. Through the inner war of doubt, fear, and loneliness, Frank began to see that the fight wasn't just external, it was within himself. Elon Musk's radical mindset had planted a seed, challenging him to defy the limitations imposed by age and circumstance. And in that seed lay the possibility of rebirth, purpose, and a new kind of strength. The war was still raging, but Frank was ready to face it head-on. The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds as Frank sat at his kitchen table, the old typewriter humming softly under his fingers. The decision he had made days ago to write again had blossomed into a small but bold act, the first spark in a long dormant fire. Each click of the keys was more than just letters on a page, it was a declaration that he was still here, still fighting, still dreaming. Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of innovation and refusal to accept limits, Frank committed himself to a new routine. Every morning, he rose early, pulled on his worn jacket, and took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The world was changing rapidly, and though his legs ached, the fresh air and rhythm of his steps grounded him. The walks became his meditation, a way to clear the fog of doubt and summon strength for the challenges ahead. One morning, Frank noticed the small community bulletin board at the local library had a flyer advertising a senior writing workshop. The idea of sitting among others who might share his passion stirred something unfamiliar, hope mixed with fear. Could he really open himself up again after years of silence? The night before the workshop, Frank reread Elon Musk's words from a podcast: "You have to be willing to take risks, to fail, to rebuild. That's how progress happens." With trembling hands, he registered and committed himself to showing up. The workshop was held in a modest room filled with folding chairs and a scattering of well-worn notebooks. Frank was one of the oldest in the group, surrounded by faces both familiar and new. As the session began, the instructor encouraged participants to share their stories, their fears, and their dreams. Frank hesitated, his voice rough with disuse, but as he spoke about the factory, his family, and the long-lost dream of writing, the room grew silent, attentive. The encouragement he received was a balm to his soul, and for the first time in years, Frank felt seen. Returning home, Frank decided to create a blog to share his journey, a digital space where he could chronicle not only his writing but also the struggles and small victories of reinvention. Setting up the blog was a challenge, the unfamiliar technology was intimidating, but Frank remembered Elon's persistent spirit and refused to give up. Slowly, he learned to navigate the online world, posting his stories, reflections, and thoughts. To his surprise, comments began to trickle in, words of encouragement from strangers who saw parts of themselves in his story. Frank's blog became a virtual community, a place where others who felt invisible could find a voice. Around the same time, Frank began clearing out his cluttered garage, transforming it into a small writing nook. Dusty boxes gave way to a simple desk, a comfortable chair, and better lighting. The space became a sanctuary where he could escape the creeping sense of obsolescence and lose himself in the flow of creativity. The transformation was symbolic, a man reclaiming his identity not through machines or robots but through words and connection. Yet, this new beginning was not without its tests. The factory announced an accelerated closure date. Frank's co-workers packed up their lockers, faces grim, futures uncertain. The news hit Frank like a punch to the gut. His routine, his community, his sense of purpose threatened to vanish overnight. He wrestled with fear and anger, wondering if all his efforts were futile. But then he remembered Elon's tweet, "Embrace change. It's the only way to survive and thrive." With a deep breath, Frank doubled down on his blog and writing, channeling his fear into action. His words grew stronger, more honest, resonating with readers who shared their own stories of loss and hope. One evening, as Frank typed late into the night, he received an unexpected email from a local newspaper editor who had stumbled upon his blog. They wanted to feature his story. It was the first real recognition Frank had received in years, a beacon cutting through the darkness. The feature article brought new readers, and Frank's confidence soared. The man who once feared invisibility was becoming a voice for those who felt forgotten. At the same time, Frank reached out to Susan, sending her a heartfelt email that included a story he had written about their shared past. It was an olive branch, a way to bridge the years of silence and misunderstanding. Susan's reply was tentative but genuine. They began exchanging messages more regularly, peeling back layers of hurt and misunderstanding. The slow rebuilding of their relationship became a source of strength for Frank, a reminder that transformation wasn't just personal but relational. Each step forward was a victory against the odds, a testament to the power of small changes to ignite big shifts. Frank's days were fuller, his spirit lighter. He was no longer defined by the factory or the looming shadow of the robot but by the stories he told and the connections he nurtured. The journey was far from over, but the one thing he changed, the choice to start again, had set him on a path he never thought possible. And as Elon Musk once said, it wasn't about age or circumstance but about daring to begin. Frank sat in his garage-turned writing nook late into the night, the glow of his laptop screen casting soft shadows on the walls lined with faded photographs and typewritten pages. Months had passed since he first dusted off the old typewriter and started that morning walk inspired by Elon Musk's fearless mindset. Now his words were reaching farther than he'd dared imagine. His blog post about life after the factory closure had gone viral, sparking conversations among people who felt just as invisible and forgotten as he once did. The flood of messages was overwhelming, stories of lost jobs, loneliness, and dreams deferred. But also of resilience, courage, and new beginnings. Frank read each comment with a growing sense of connection and purpose. One night, a message stood out, from a woman named Linda, who shared how Frank's writing had inspired her to start volunteering at a local shelter after years of feeling stuck. Another came from a retired teacher in Georgia, who thanked Frank for reminding her that it wasn't too late to pursue her passion for painting. Frank realized his story was no longer just his own, it had become a beacon for others walking similar paths. This recognition stirred something deep inside, a mixture of pride, vulnerability, and hope. Yet the breakthrough wasn't without its raw moments. As his story spread, old wounds reopened. Susan called unexpectedly one afternoon, her voice hesitant but sincere. "Dad, I saw the article. I'm proud of you." The words meant more than she could know, but also reminded Frank of the years lost to silence. He swallowed the lump in his throat, telling her he wanted to rebuild what had been broken. Their conversations grew longer, more frequent, filled with awkward apologies and fragile promises. Reconnecting wasn't easy, years of distance and misunderstanding hung like a fog, but the breakthrough was real. Another vulnerable moment came when Frank was invited to speak at a local community event about aging and reinvention. Standing before a crowd of strangers, his hands shaking, he shared his story, the factory, the fear, the robot, the writing, and the gradual reclaiming of his life. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the faces in the crowd, the nods, the tears, the smiles, that made Frank realize the power of honest storytelling. His vulnerability had become a bridge to others' hearts. Meanwhile, Frank finished the manuscript he'd been working on for months, a memoir weaving his journey with reflections on resilience, fearlessness, and transformation. Sending the manuscript to a publisher was another leap into the unknown, but the act itself was a victory. He imagined Elon Musk's words echoing in his mind, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." The publishing house responded with enthusiasm, offering a contract to bring Frank's story to print. This milestone symbolized more than professional success, it was proof that his late-in-life reinvention was possible. As Frank's new legacy took shape, he still faced moments of doubt. Some mornings his body ached unbearably, some nights loneliness crept back. Yet he had learned to sit with those feelings without surrendering to them. The inner war had softened, replaced by a quiet resilience. He began mentoring other seniors who reached out through his blog, encouraging them to find their own sparks. The community he built online blossomed into in-person meetups and writing circles, giving many a safe space to share and grow. One day, Frank visited Mary's grave, the sun warm on his face. He whispered, "I was lost, but I'm finding my way back. Thank you for believing in me, even when I forgot to believe in myself." The moment was heavy with emotion, love, loss, and renewal all entwined. Frank realized his transformation was about more than personal gain, it was about honoring the past while embracing the future. Elon Musk's robot unveiling had initially felt like a death sentence, but in truth, it had sparked a rebirth. The robot symbolized change, yes, but also the human capacity to adapt, to resist invisibility, and to reclaim purpose. Frank's story was no longer about fading away but about breaking through. Shattering the barriers of age, doubt, and fear to stand tall again. His journey illuminated a powerful truth for everyone feeling left behind: it's never too late to matter, to create, to love, and to be seen. The breakthrough wasn't an end but a doorway to endless possibilities, and Frank was ready to walk through it. Frank sat quietly in his living room, the afternoon sun casting long, warm shadows across the worn carpet. The house felt different now, not empty or silent, but alive with possibility. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter with Elon Musk's words, a dusty typewriter, and a spark of hope had transformed him in ways he hadn't imagined possible. He reflected on the path he had traveled, the fears, the doubts, the setbacks, and how each step had led to this moment of peace and purpose. His relationship with Susan was healing, slowly but surely. They talked about everything, the past mistakes, the dreams still waiting to be chased, and the future they could build together. Susan admitted she had been wrong to dismiss his resilience and now saw him not as an aging relic but as a man full of life and ideas. Frank's writing had taken on new meaning too. His memoir, once just a personal catharsis, had become a source of inspiration for many. The letters and messages he received from readers across the country filled his days with warmth and gratitude. People shared how his story gave them courage to start over, to challenge the labels society had placed on them, and to embrace their own second chances. Frank understood then that legacy wasn't about wealth or fame, it was about impact. The ripples one life could send across the waters of time. He thought of Elon Musk again, the man who had sparked this transformation not by rescuing him but by challenging him to rethink what was possible. Elon's radical belief that age, failure, and fear were only obstacles if one let them be had become a guiding light. Frank had discovered that the true revolution wasn't in the robots or rockets but in the human spirit's capacity to defy limits. One afternoon, Frank visited the local community center where he now led a weekly writing group for seniors. Watching the faces light up as they shared stories and encouraged one another, he realized how far he'd come from the isolation and despair that had once consumed him. The group was a vibrant tapestry of experiences, each person weaving their own thread of hope and resilience. Frank felt proud to be part of this living legacy, a network of voices rising together to say, "We still matter." At home, Frank's garage was no longer just a writing nook but a creative studio filled with notebooks, paintings from Susan, and photos capturing moments of connection. The space symbolized not just his personal rebirth but the shared journey of those around him. Late at night, Frank sometimes thought about the factory, the life he had left behind. There was sadness for what was lost, but also gratitude for what had been learned. The robot that once threatened to replace his livelihood had instead replaced his despair with possibility. Frank whispered to the empty room, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." And now, he gave himself that permission every day. As the seasons changed, Frank received news that his memoir was being adapted into a documentary, a chance to reach even more people with his message of hope and transformation. The prospect both excited and humbled him. He knew the journey ahead would have challenges, but he faced them with the confidence that had been forged through struggle and renewal. One evening, Frank sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and pink. He thought about the countless others who might be feeling lost or forgotten, wondering if change was even possible. For them, he wished to send a message, a beacon of encouragement born from his own story. "It's never too late to begin again," he said softly to the fading light. "The spark is inside you. All you have to do is believe." Frank's new legacy was clear: to live fully, to create boldly, and to inspire others to do the same, no matter their age or circumstance. His life was proof that the end of one chapter could be the thrilling start of another. And in that truth lay the greatest gift of all, a reminder that we all have the power to change our story, to matter deeply, and to leave the world a little brighter than we found it. Frank had settled into his new rhythm, writing, connecting, mentoring, but just as he was beginning to feel comfortable, life threw him a curveball. One chilly autumn morning, he received a letter from the local community college. The administration invited him to participate in a pilot program aimed at helping older adults learn new digital skills, something Frank had dabbled in while managing his blog. The letter was clear: "We believe your experience and story could inspire others to embrace technology and change." Frank's first reaction was a mix of excitement and nerves. He thought back to the early days, fumbling with setting up his blog, wrestling with unfamiliar devices. Now, he was being asked to help others do the same. Could he really be a guide in this new terrain? The pilot program began with a small group of seniors, each with their own fears about computers, smartphones, and the digital world that seemed to move faster than their own pace. Frank recognized their hesitation, it mirrored his own from just months before. His approach was patient and personal. He shared his journey from uncertainty to confidence, the story of the robot unveiling that had sparked his transformation, and how embracing change was not just possible but necessary. The classroom buzzed with tentative hope as Frank helped the group navigate email accounts, social media, and online writing platforms. He watched as faces lit up with new understanding, and realized this was more than a class, it was a lifeline. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's latest news made headlines again, a groundbreaking partnership to build a new AI-driven manufacturing plant designed to create jobs, not just replace them. Frank followed the story closely, intrigued by the shift from fear of automation to hope for innovation. He wrote a blog post reflecting on the dual nature of technology, as a disruptor and a creator. His words resonated deeply with readers grappling with similar uncertainties. Yet, the new challenge was not without friction. Some of Frank's old co-workers criticized his embrace of technology, accusing him of selling out or abandoning the real world. The factory's closure had left raw wounds, and for some, technology symbolized betrayal rather than progress. Frank listened but stood firm. He reminded himself that fear often masqueraded as anger, and that change required patience and empathy. He continued to build bridges, fostering dialogue between generations and mindsets. At home, Frank's relationship with Susan deepened. She started volunteering at the community center's tech classes, inspired by her father's example. They worked together on workshops, blending her tech savvy with his storytelling, creating a powerful team. The family bond, once frayed, was weaving stronger threads of trust and mutual respect. One day, Frank was invited to speak at a regional conference on aging and technology. Standing before an audience of policymakers, educators, and community leaders, he shared his vision. A future where older adults were not sidelined but empowered to shape the digital world. He called for programs that embraced lifelong learning, intergenerational collaboration, and compassion for those navigating change. His speech was met with applause and requests for collaboration, signaling that his voice was becoming a catalyst for broader change. Yet, the road ahead was still uncertain. Frank faced moments of exhaustion, self-doubt, and the ever-present aches of aging. He remembered Elon Musk's words, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." With renewed determination, Frank pushed forward, fueled by the faces and stories of those he was helping. The new challenge was more than mastering technology, it was about breaking stereotypes, rewriting narratives, and proving that reinvention had no age limit. Frank's journey was evolving again, a testament to the endless capacity of the human spirit to adapt, inspire, and lead. As autumn leaves drifted outside his window, Frank smiled, ready to face whatever came next. Frank hadn't expected the silence to come back. After months of momentum, public speaking, teaching, reconnecting with Susan, and feeling more alive than he had in years, something in the air began to shift. Maybe it was the winter, maybe it was fatigue, or maybe it was just the nature of growth, forward 2 steps, then back 1. Whatever it was, Frank felt it in his bones. He sat at his writing desk one cold December morning, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen, fingers motionless. The blog post he'd been trying to write about aging with courage had stalled after just 2 sentences. The ideas were there. The passion was there. But for the first time in a long time, the words wouldn't come. His mind wandered, what was he even doing? Helping seniors learn to type and send emails. Writing memoirs no one asked for. Hosting workshops in dusty community centers while the rest of the world rocketed into the future. Elon Musk was planning Mars colonies and neural interfaces. And Frank? He was wondering how to format a PDF so the printer wouldn't cut off the bottom inch. The doubt crept in slowly, like a cold draft under the door. At first, it was subtle. Just a whisper, this isn't really making a difference. But then it grew louder, no one's reading anymore. You're just another old man who got lucky for a few minutes and is stretching it out for attention. Frank closed his laptop. For the first time since he'd started writing again, he felt embarrassed, like a fraud playing dress-up in a role that didn't fit. That afternoon, during his walk, he passed the old factory lot. The building was half demolished now, a shell of its former self, surrounded by rusted fencing and signs warning trespassers away. He stood there for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, the bitter wind stinging his face. So many mornings, so many years, spent walking through those doors. He remembered the way people used to nod to him with respect. Now those people were scattered, laid off, retired, or long gone. The factory had been a kind of anchor, and without it, even with all his recent success, something in him still felt unmoored. The doubt followed him home. He skipped writing that night. And the next. By the third day, Susan noticed. "You okay, Dad?" she asked during their weekly video call. "You seem somewhere else." He waved her off at first, but she kept pressing, gently. Finally, he muttered, "I'm starting to feel like maybe this was all a fluke. The blog, the workshops, the book, maybe I just caught a moment, and now it's past. Maybe I should bow out gracefully before people realize I don't know what I'm doing." Susan was quiet for a moment, then leaned toward the camera. "You ever hear yourself talk lately? Like the way people quote you in those online posts? Or the letters I've seen in your inbox? You matter to people, Dad. You gave them something they didn't have before, permission to start again. You can't throw that away just because you had a rough week." Frank shrugged, not ready to believe her. That night, he found himself aimlessly scrolling on his phone, trying to numb the feeling of failure when he stumbled across a short video clip from Elon Musk's recent talk. The interviewer asked, "What's something people don't understand about doing big things?" Elon's answer was simple, almost quiet: "You have to accept long stretches where it feels like nothing's working. Doubt is part of the process. I don't trust ideas that never meet resistance. That's how you know they're real, when they survive that pushback." Frank watched the clip 3 times. Then again. It hit like a small punch to the chest. He remembered something else Elon had said once: "If something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you should still do it." Frank closed the app and walked out into the garage. It was dark and cold, but he didn't turn on the heater. He sat down at his desk and pulled out a legal pad, the one he saved for moments that needed to be written by hand. At the top of the page, he scribbled, "What I'd tell someone else if they were me." And the words began to come. Not pretty at first, not polished, but real. Raw. Honest. He wrote about the doubt. About feeling like a fraud. About how success isn't a straight line. About how even people who look like they have it all figured out, the Elons of the world, still struggle, still fail, still wake up sometimes wondering what the hell they're doing. He wrote until his fingers cramped. Then he wrote some more. The next morning, he typed it up and titled the blog post, "The Doubt That Makes You Real." It was his most personal post yet. He almost didn't publish it. But he remembered what Susan said. And what Elon said. He hit post. Within hours, the response began flooding in. Comments. Shares. Emails from people around the world. Some were older than Frank, some younger, but all of them said the same thing: "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." A man from Texas wrote, "I thought I was the only one who felt like a failure at 67. A woman in Vermont commented, "I cried reading this. You just gave me the courage to keep going with my own blog." Even a former coworker, someone who had scoffed at Frank's second act, wrote, "You're more real than any of us, Frank. Keep going." He leaned back in his chair and exhaled, the doubt not gone, but quieter now. He knew it would come back, doubt always did, but he also knew now how to face it. Not with shame. Not with silence. But with honesty. With persistence. With the simple decision to keep showing up. That's the thing no one tells you about transformation, it doesn't happen all at once. You don't just change and then stay changed. You have to keep choosing it. Again and again. Even when you're tired. Even when you're afraid. Even when you think you're not enough. Especially then. Frank looked around the garage and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because he had kept going. That was the breakthrough, not success, not attention, not being fixed. Just not giving up. Not letting the story end on a low note. Not believing the lie that it was too late. Because it wasn't. And it never had been. Frank didn't plan to speak on national television. He wasn't chasing fame, and he certainly didn't think of himself as the kind of man who belonged under studio lights or in front of a live camera. But sometimes, life has a way of calling you forward the moment you stop hiding from it. It started with a producer from a major network who had been following Frank's blog. She sent an email titled simply, "Your Voice Matters." She explained that the station was running a segment on aging, technology, and reinvention, and they wanted Frank to share his story on air. His first reaction was to laugh. Out loud. Alone in his kitchen, coffee halfway to his lips, he stared at the screen like it was a prank. National television? Me? But the producer was serious. She'd read his post about doubt, about failure, and about the day he'd nearly given up. That kind of honesty, she said, didn't just resonate, it inspired. People need to hear from someone who's lived through the fear and didn't let it define them, she wrote. We're saturated with noise. What you have is rare, truth and hope. Frank sat with the decision for 3 days. It wasn't just fear that held him back, it was the weight of expectation. What if he said something stupid? What if he froze? What if all the people who had once doubted him saw it and laughed? But then he remembered a quote he'd written down months earlier from Elon Musk, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." And what was the disaster? For Frank, it was going back to that slow fade, to that hollow version of himself who watched the world through a window, waiting for permission to live again. He emailed the producer, "I'm in." 2 weeks later, Frank was standing backstage, mic clipped to his lapel, trying to breathe past the drumbeat of his heart. The studio was colder than he expected. Clean. Bright. Impersonal. But the crew was kind. One young assistant, maybe 25 at most, whispered, "Hey, my granddad started learning to code because of your blog. He talks about you all the time." Frank blinked. He hadn't expected that. He nodded a soft thank you, feeling the knot in his chest loosen slightly. When the segment began, the host introduced Frank with warmth and genuine admiration. They showed clips from his workshops, photos of the old factory, and excerpts from his viral blog posts. Frank took his seat, and the questions began. How did it feel to lose your job to a robot? What made you start writing again? What would you tell other people in their 60s and 70s who feel like they've missed their chance? Frank answered the only way he knew how, honestly. I didn't think I had anything left, he said. But I realized that the story I was telling myself, that I was too old, too late, too far gone, wasn't the truth. It was just a habit. And once I started challenging that story, everything started changing. The host leaned in. Do you think technology is the enemy of older people? Frank shook his head. No. I think fear is. Technology's just a tool. It can isolate you or connect you. But fear, that voice that tells you to sit down, stay quiet, fade away, that's the real danger. I listened to that voice for years. But not anymore. The segment ended with applause. Backstage, Frank exhaled like he hadn't in days. He wasn't sure how he'd done. He wasn't sure if his words had landed. But it didn't matter. He'd shown up. He hadn't run from it. And that, he knew, was enough. The episode aired the following evening, and within hours, Frank's inbox exploded. People from all over the country, retirees, teachers, mechanics, single moms, veterans, former factory workers, wrote to say thank you. Some told him they'd started painting again. Others said they'd signed up for their first ever writing class. A man in his 80s said he finally emailed his estranged brother. A woman who'd been afraid to learn how to use a smartphone said she'd bought one and followed his blog right after the show. Frank was overwhelmed. Humbled. Grateful. But more than anything, he felt something return to him that he hadn't even known he'd lost: direction. This wasn't about one story or one post anymore. This was a movement. A quiet one, yes. But powerful. He wasn't just reaching people, he was reminding them of who they still were, and what they still had to give. A week later, Susan invited him to speak at her workplace, an urban tech startup that had launched a mentorship program pairing retired professionals with young developers. Frank didn't hesitate. The office was bright and open, filled with standing desks and digital whiteboards. He walked in wearing his usual button-up shirt and jacket, surrounded by hoodies and sneakers, but the respect was instant. He spoke not just about technology, but about resilience, about rebuilding identity when everything familiar is taken away. He told them about the robot, not as a villain, but as a symbol. That robot didn't take my life, he said. It gave me the chance to build a new one. After the talk, a young programmer named Malik approached him. You know, he said, I've been terrified of burnout. I'm 28 and I already feel like I'm running out of time. But hearing you speak, man, it reminds me that the road's a lot longer than I thought. And that's a good thing. Frank smiled. He was no longer just writing for his generation. He was reaching across the divide, connecting the young and the old, proving that fear and purpose weren't bound by age. That night, back in his garage, he returned to the blog. Not to write about himself this time, but about the idea of legacy. Not in the old-fashioned sense, wills and assets, but in the new one. The echoes we leave in people, the spark we give them when we dare to rise. He titled it, You're Still Building Something. And it was true. Every word he wrote. Every person he spoke to. Every step he took forward, even when the doubt lingered. Frank wasn't winding down, he was ramping up. Reaching further. And somewhere, he imagined Elon Musk smiling, not because Frank had started a company or launched a spacecraft, but because he'd done the harder thing, he'd refused to accept the story of decline. He'd rewritten it. And now, he was helping others do the same. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It was nearly midnight when Frank got the call. He had just finished reading a stack of letters from seniors across the country, some handwritten, others printed from email by grandchildren, and a few read aloud by caregivers for those who couldn't see the screen. Every message carried a piece of someone else's story, stitched with fear, grit, hope. But the phone call that night wasn't from a reader. It was from Harold. Frank, it's me. The voice was older, heavier, marked with a weariness that hadn't been there 30 years ago. Frank hadn't spoken to Harold since the night Mary died. They'd been best friends once, working side by side at the factory, talking about muscle cars and backyard barbecues, raising families on opposite ends of the same street. But they hadn't spoken since the argument. Frank swallowed. Harold, he said slowly. It's been a long time. Yeah, Harold said. Too long. I've been reading about you. You're kind of a big deal now, huh? Frank laughed, but gently. I'm not sure about that. Just trying not to rust away. There was a long pause. Frank could hear breathing, the crackle of an old landline maybe, or just time sitting between them. Then Harold said, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I said that night. About Mary. About the job. I was angry. I didn't know how to deal with the change. You were always the strong one, and when the factory closed, and Mary passed, it all just fell apart. Frank leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the past sliding across his mind like old film. I was angry too, he said. At everything. At you. At myself. It just swallowed me up. Harold cleared his throat. I've been following what you're doing. Teaching old guys like us to use computers. Writing about starting over. I didn't think I needed any of that. But I was wrong. Frank felt his chest tighten. You're not too late, Harold. You never were. Yeah, well, Harold said, funny thing. I read that post of yours, the one about doubt, and I signed up for one of those digital literacy classes at the library. I'm the worst in the room, but I can send emails now. Even made a Facebook account. Found my granddaughter on there. We talk every day now. Frank smiled, his throat thick. That's beautiful, man. I just wanted you to know, Harold said, his voice softening, that what you're doing. It matters. It really does. You gave me a spark. After they hung up, Frank sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window. The neighborhood was quiet. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the sidewalks and blanketing the sleeping world. Sparks. That's what it was all about. Not revolutions. Not headlines. Sparks in the dark, tiny, quiet moments of light that caught fire in someone's soul and made them move again. A call here. A blog post there. A conversation in a coffee shop. He realized he didn't need to change the whole world. Just light one spark at a time. The next day, he began planning a new project, a series of small, local meetups he would call Spark Nights, gatherings in libraries, coffee shops, senior centers, and church basements. No lectures. No slideshows. Just people sharing what they'd always wanted to try but were too afraid to begin. It wasn't about fixing anyone. It was about showing up. Sitting in a circle. Being seen. The first Spark Night happened on a cold January evening in the back room of a bookstore. Frank expected maybe 5 people. 20 showed up. One woman, Edna, said she wanted to learn to sing again. My voice went away after my husband died. I used to be in the church choir. Now I just hum alone in the kitchen. A man named Bill said he'd always dreamed of building wooden boats but never got around to it. Another woman, Teresa, said she missed painting. I stopped after my kids grew up. Felt like there wasn't a point anymore. Frank listened to each of them and shared his own fear, that maybe his best days were behind him, until he decided they weren't. They talked for hours. No one wanted to leave. The bookstore owner had to gently remind them to lock up. Word spread. Within weeks, Spark Nights were happening in 3 towns. Then 5. People began hosting them on their own. One man in Kansas wrote, I've started teaching carpentry to kids in my garage. Something clicked after that first meeting. A woman in Florida said she now hosted a poetry group in her retirement village. Frank, I hadn't felt alive like this in 20 years. Thank you for giving us permission. But Frank knew he hadn't given them anything. He'd only lit a match and handed it over. They'd started their own fires. He began traveling to visit some of these groups, taking the train or driving long hours to sit in folding chairs with people who had stopped believing in themselves a long time ago. Some of them couldn't walk without help. Others spoke through tears. A few were survivors of loss so deep, Frank could barely hold the weight of their words. But they were there. They showed up. And that was the miracle. Frank began collecting their stories. Not to publish. Just to remember. Because he knew that when doubt came back, and it always did, these were the sparks he'd need to keep his own fire alive. At one meetup, a teenager showed up with his grandmother. He told the group he'd read Frank's blog and brought her because she was amazing and didn't even know it. Frank was stunned. A teenager reading his blog. Bridging generations. Later that night, Frank opened his laptop in a motel room and wrote, "You never know who your spark will reach. So keep striking, even in the dark." The post went viral. Again. Frank was invited to a TEDx talk. A podcast. Even an online summit on aging and purpose in the digital era, where he shared a virtual stage with neuroscientists and futurists. But he never let it go to his head. He kept going to Spark nights. Kept listening. Kept learning. The fame didn't matter. The connection did. Each night, he ended the gatherings the same way. He held up a candle, just a simple wax candle from a dollar store, and said, "This is your story. It's not done yet. And no matter how small the flame, it can still light someone else's way." He lit the candle and passed it to someone in the circle. They'd pass it along, one to another, until every face was glowing in the soft, flickering light. Sparks in the dark. That's what this was. That's what he was now. Not a celebrity. Not a tech guru. Just a man who stopped waiting to be forgotten and started remembering how to burn. It arrived on a Wednesday. The mail had been slow that week, cold weather, icy roads, the kind of logistical delays Frank was used to living in a rural pocket of the Midwest. He wasn't expecting much. A flyer from the pharmacy. A bill from the power company. Maybe another newsletter from the senior center. But there, tucked between an envelope with a pre-printed "urgent" and a catalog for gardening tools, was a sleek, matte black envelope with a silver embossed return address, SpaceX. Frank stood still in the entryway, coat still on, snow melting on his boots. He turned the envelope over in his hand, almost afraid to open it. It had no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The name in the top left corner was printed in clean, capitalized letters, E. Musk. Frank sat down at the kitchen table, tore the envelope open slowly, and slid out a single, heavy card. No logo. No colors. Just clean white paper, and handwriting. Real ink. Not a printed message, not a PR note, but a letter. Frank. I've read your work. I've watched some of your Spark night clips. I wanted to say thank you. People talk about innovation like it's only about machines or Mars. But what you're doing, changing minds, rekindling belief in people who think their best days are behind them, that's the kind of transformation we rarely see. It's harder than building rockets. People are harder than rockets. You've reminded me of something important. We can't afford to lose wisdom just because we ignore age. You've shown that age is not the end of relevance, it's the engine of resilience. If you're ever in Texas, come see the Starbase. I'd be glad to meet you in person. Keep going. We need more sparks. Elon. Frank read the letter twice. Then again. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he did both. The paper trembled in his hand. Elon Musk, the man whose robotic factory announcement had nearly broken him, was now thanking him. Not for programming. Not for investing. But for believing. The irony struck Frank like a thunderclap. It was Elon's announcement that had once filled him with fear, made him feel obsolete, a relic of a dying workforce. And now, years later, it was Elon's voice, again, that brought him full circle. Only this time, it wasn't fear. It was validation. He walked the letter into the garage, placed it gently on the wall next to the corkboard where he kept postcards from Spark Night attendees, notes from readers, and photos of him and Susan. The letter went in the center, right above a faded sticky note that read, "You're still building something." That night, Frank sat at his desk and wrote a blog post. But this one wasn't about robots or aging or starting over. It was about honor. What do you do when the person who once represented your deepest fear writes to thank you? You listen. And then you keep going. He titled it, "The Letter I Didn't Expect." By the next morning, the post had gone viral again, more than 80,000 shares in 48 hours. News outlets picked it up. The story trended, former factory worker who lost job to robot gets handwritten letter from Elon Musk. But Frank didn't care about the headlines. What mattered was the flood of comments from people who said it gave them hope. A retired miner in West Virginia. A former teacher from Colorado. A 72-year-old widow in California. One by one, they shared their stories, of loss, yes, but also of longing. Longing to matter. Frank couldn't ignore the invitation. Texas felt far. Starbase felt even farther. But there was a part of him, a part that hadn't quieted since reading Elon's letter, that whispered, "Go." Susan was the first to encourage him. "You should go, Dad. It's not about Elon. It's about you. You've come full circle. That place represents where it all started. You need to walk into it now, not as the man who got replaced, but the man who redefined what it means to begin again." Frank nodded. She was right. He reached out to the SpaceX contact on the envelope and booked his trip. 3 weeks later, Frank was standing on the tarmac at Starbase, looking up at one of the most advanced launch vehicles in human history. A SpaceX team member met him at the gate, handed him a visitor badge, and walked him through the facility. The sounds were sharp, hissing hydraulics, hums of testing systems, voices trading acronyms and launch codes, but Frank felt something else under it all, wonder. He hadn't felt this kind of electric anticipation since his daughter was born. Elon met him in one of the control rooms, dressed in jeans and a black t-shirt, nodding with that familiar calm intensity. "Frank," he said, shaking his hand firmly. "It's good to meet the man lighting fires all over the country." Frank chuckled. "And here I thought I was just trying not to fade out." They sat for nearly 2 hours, not in front of cameras or microphones, but in a quiet corner with coffee. They talked about change, and resistance to it. About the mindsets that build things, and the ones that try to tear them down. Elon listened more than he spoke, genuinely curious about the movement Frank had sparked. "You know," Elon said, "I think people think tech is the hard part. But people, that's the real complexity. Teaching someone to build a rocket takes math. Teaching someone to believe they still matter, that takes something else entirely." Frank smiled. "That's because we're not wired to adapt as fast as machines. We need stories. We need proof that the pain doesn't mean it's over." Elon leaned forward. "Maybe that's your next mission, showing the world that aging isn't a slowdown. It's an acceleration, if we treat it right." Before Frank left, Elon walked him to a quiet bay near the vehicle assembly building. Inside was a sleek humanoid robot prototype. Elon gestured toward it. "This scared you once, didn't it?" Frank nodded. "It represented everything I thought I'd lost. And now?" Frank looked at it again. "Now it's just a tool. Nothing more." Elon smiled. "Exactly. The story is never about the robot. It's about the person who decides what to do after the robot shows up." Frank returned home changed again, but this time, not from fear or pain. From clarity. From standing in the belly of the machine that had once represented the end of his identity and realizing he no longer feared it. Because he had an identity now. One he had built with his own hands, his own heart. He spoke about the visit at the next Spark night, holding up a printout of Elon's letter. "We spend so much time thinking the world's moved on without us. But what if it hasn't? What if it's just waiting for us to jump back in?" The group applauded, not just because he met Elon Musk, but because they had been part of the journey. They'd watched Frank transform, and in doing so, had begun their own transformations. That night, alone in the garage, Frank wrote in his notebook. The robot that replaced me became the spark that rebuilt me. And now, I light sparks for others. Not because I'm special, but because I refuse to stay in the dark. He closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, stars blinked quietly over the quiet town. The same stars Elon's rockets chased. The same stars Frank used to wonder under, unsure if life would ever feel big again. Now he knew the truth, life was always big. You just had to be brave enough to step back into it. Frank looked at the letter from Elon Musk pinned above his desk and felt the quiet hum of responsibility ripple through him. The invitation to visit Starbase had been more than a journey, it had been a reckoning. He realized that his transformation had become more than personal. It had become a movement. And with that realization came a new chapter, one he didn't expect but couldn't ignore. He decided to channel this energy into something bigger than any single life, something that echoed, multiplied, and lingered long after words faded. He began by reaching out to community leaders in towns where Spark Nights had taken hold. He offered to facilitate a Spark training session. A simple format teaching others how to host gatherings of hope, including sharing stories, lighting a candle, and sparking conversations. He crafted it carefully, a flexible, emotional tool for anyone who felt called to light a spark. As the flurry of emails and responses came back, it was clear, this was wanted. Frank's garage transformed again, not into a writing den, not into a studio, but into a planning hub. Maps littered the walls, notes filched with names, addresses of libraries, church basements, coffee shops, and even prison outreach centers. He sketched routes and options, eager to be the spark that helped others become sparklighters themselves. In late winter, Frank took to traveling. He packed his bags and drove through winding country roads to small towns. The first stop was in Iowa, Newton, where a civic group asked Frank to lead a spark training at the community center. The room filled with a dozen older adults, some hunched, some skeptical, all tired of feeling silenced. Frank spoke about invisible worth, about reclaiming narrative through simple acts. He taught them to light the candle, to speak their fears and hopes aloud, to pass warmth across a room. At the end, Mary's favorite hymn played softly, sung by a local choir. People wept. People hugged. People vowed to do it again. Next, he took the train to Detroit, where a renovated school gym welcomed him, filled with retirees, young teachers, civic volunteers. The energy pulsed. Spark Nights were already happening, but with Frank's training, they became intentional, organized, inclusive. He listened to one woman, Deborah, who said she'd felt sawed off from the world since her husband died. But tonight, she said, I felt rooted again. I felt heard. At home, emails poured in, requests for a guide, advice on organizing, help overcoming doubt. Frank realized the ripple was more than metaphor, it was alive. He spent nights composing a spark guide, short, clear, emotional. How to start. What to say. How to love. His hands trembled as he typed the words, knowing they could change someone's world. As spring bloomed, Frank's Spark Guide began circulating online and in print. A senior center in Texas printed copies for every member. Friends of his granddaughter ordered them for retirement communities. He heard of virtual Spark Nights hosting in Australia, Norway, and South Africa, using his words as a template. He couldn't believe it, one dusty Ohio factory worker's idea, now echoing around the globe. One evening, as sun settled low, Frank opened his laptop and read the latest email. It was from a man, 79 years old, writing from rural Alabama. He'd always been a quiet man with a fishing tackle shop. After reading Frank's guide, he hosted his own Spark Night in the back room of his store. He invited neighbors. One man told everyone he'd always wanted to play the guitar. Another admitted he'd never forgiven himself for walking away from his daughter. Yet another woman said she missed writing songs for Sunday school. By the end, they sang karaoke together, strangers turned community. A spark lit in a fishing shop, the email read. Thank you for the flicker. Frank closed the laptop, his chest full. These were the ripples, small, human, beautiful. He realized the robot that once represented his doom had instead overturned his life into an epic of belonging. And now, each guide, each gathering, each tear and smile was proof that renewal wasn't reserved for the young. It was available to anyone brave enough to kindle the flame. One afternoon, Susan came to help in the garage. She spread maps and post-it notes, helping label spots where Spark training could expand. She told him of a tech incubator in Chicago that wanted to host an intergenerational night, young coders paired with seniors telling stories. She showed him a prototype of an app based on his guide. We're just extending your spark, she said, and Frank's throat tightened. Over the next weeks, Frank found himself being interviewed again, this time as the architect of a grassroots movement that honored aging and connection. He told interviewers the same thing he'd said in the TV studio long ago, that fear was the enemy, not technology, not age. That the real revolution happens when we light one another, not dim ourselves. At a national aging conference, Frank stood before hundreds of people, caregivers, activists, older adults, social workers. He shared statistics about loneliness among seniors, and stories from Spark nights. The most advanced tech can't fix what one human voice can heal, he said. When we say, I'm still here, we breathe life back into ourselves, and we breathe courage into others. Afterward, an aide approached him. Your movement inspired a grant from the foundation. They want to fund Spark training kits to distribute across rural counties. Will you help? Frank nodded, speechless. He thought about that moment in the garage when he tapped the first key on the typewriter, unsure, silent. And now, this. The little idea had become a mission. That night, Frank returned home and looked around his garage. The letter from Elon still hung, the guide drafts, club photos, maps, printed words of hope. He lit a candle and sat with it. He thought of Mary, of Susan, of the men and women who'd lit their own sparks. He thought of Harold calling him. Of the children learning to code who never believed they could. He thought, none of this was about building rockets or robots. It was about hearts. Lighted, shared, unafraid. Frank whispered into the flame, this is not the end. It's only beginning to ripple. Frank had imagined what a new dream might feel like, something quieter, softer, maybe safer, but standing in his garage one evening, surrounded by maps, notes, and face-worn stories, he realized that his vision had grown far beyond what he'd ever planned. The dream wasn't just sparking lives, it was building a movement, one that might just change how society saw aging, resilience, and the power of small acts shared. He sat at his desk, tracing the routes of Spark nights across the country, marked in colorful pushpins. The seed had been sown in Ohio, and now, thanks to a simple guide and heartfelt encouragement, it had taken root in the most unexpected places. A fishing shop in Alabama, a prison yard in Kansas, cafes in Norway and South Africa. Each pushpin represented a person who chose to believe again, against the drift of time and doubt. Frank thought about Elon Musk's journey, the failures, the risk-soaked nights, the audacity to keep going when every rational voice told him to stop. SpaceX rockets, Zip2, PayPal, Tesla, they were born from adversity, audacity, and an unwavering belief that the future could be different. Frank had once feared the robot, an emblem of obsolescence, but now recognized it as a mirror of his transformation. Elon had shown him that daring to rewrite the future was the only way to reclaim it. Frank drafted a new post on his blog. Not a memoir, or a letter, but a declaration. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about a future where aging isn't fading, it's forging. Where every step backward can become a step forward if we lean into the spark. He posted it at dusk, letting the city lights flicker on outside, feeling hopeful. Almost instantly, messages poured in. A woman in Philadelphia offered to translate the Spark Guide into Spanish. A retired school principal in Georgia invited Frank to be part of a regional consortium redesigning senior engagement. A design team in Seattle began prototyping a Spark Box, a simple candle kit with story prompts for small gatherings. The movement was evolving, surprising him with each iteration. Ever practical and cautious, Frank worried whether he had the capacity to help every request. But then he remembered Elon's ethos: iteration, growth, resilience. One doesn't build a rocket in one piece, every breakthrough comes from trial, failure, adjustment. He created a small team. Virtual, mostly. Susan led communications. Melly, a former teacher from Detroit, helped manage regional outreach. Harold, finally comfortable in the digital world, offered to mentor other reluctant seniors. They met weekly online, dreaming together under pixelated lights. Frank found himself part of a design session with the Seattle team, seeing their prototypes come alive, the gentle latch of a candle kit, fold-out bookmarks quoting his words, companion journal pages. It wasn't about marketing, it was about making hope tangible. One evening, back in the garage, Frank held the prototype in his hands. His chest tightened, heart full. The idea he'd sketched one late night, the Spark Box, was real. Not sleek, not polished, but real. Something people could hold, light, and say, "I still matter." That night, he wrote another post. The spark doesn't have to be big. Sometimes it's just a box and a candle and a question: what did you always want to try? From there, the fire grows. It began quietly. Slowly. But like all real fires, it was hungry. And now, millions could feel its warmth. The months that followed felt like watching embers catch flame. Frank's once humble dream of writing again had grown into a living, breathing movement, and now, that movement was taking an even bolder step: the formation of the Spark Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to igniting purpose across generations. What began with a typewriter in a dusty attic had morphed into something bigger than any one life. It was a promise to the world that dreams didn't expire with age. Frank sat at his desk one evening, surrounded by the prototypes of Spark boxes, piles of Spark guides, and handwritten notes from volunteers eager to help. Susan's voice on the video call crackled with excitement. "We've filed the paperwork. The foundation's official. We even got our non-profit status." Her grin was contagious, lighting up his worn face. "Now we can apply for grants, partner with libraries, senior centers, and even tech incubators. This is it, Dad. The dream is ready to fly." Frank leaned back, chest full of hope. It felt surreal to be leading an organization aimed at helping people rediscover themselves, to be coordinating with partners in California, Florida, even abroad, all from his garage, his former sanctuary, now headquarters. He thought back to Elon Musk's words: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Against the odds, his spark had become movement. The initial grant proposals poured in. One foundation in Vermont offered funding for Spark Nights in rural communities. A tech firm in Seattle donated tablet devices to help seniors connect online through storytelling workshops. In Chicago, the consortium Susan mentioned planned a citywide Spark Festival, bringing together youth and elders around fires of shared experience. Frank's heart swelled thinking of the ripple, the expanding wave. Yet, with growth came doubts. Frank lay awake some nights, unsure whether he was up to the task. Organizational leadership, fundraising, legal requirements, these were worlds away from the rhythm of keystrokes and evening writing. The imposter voice whispered, "You're out of your depth. Who are you to lead?" He shut his eyes, breathing through the fear, and something rose in him, a quiet resolve he barely recognized until he spoke it aloud in the darkness: "I have to lean into it." Morning brought clarity. Frank drafted a blog post titled "Age Forged, Not Lost," weaving in another of Elon's truths: "I think it is possible for ordinary people to choose to be extraordinary." He wrote about ordinary people choosing extraordinary paths, not through grand gestures, but through persistence, storytelling, and communal bravery. The words felt steady, alive. Within days, the post received thousands of comments, stories from teachers who'd reignited their passion, veterans building workshops, retirees knitting virtual communities. One reader wrote, "We're rewriting what a second act looks like, thank you for inviting us in." Frank realized that leadership didn't begin with authority, it began with invitation. The first official Spark Foundation workshop was held in a modest library in rural Ohio. Frank drove hours across frosty roads to greet the neighbors he'd never met, setting up folders of Spark guides and Spark boxes. The room filled slowly. Some with warm expectant eyes, others skeptical glances, but all curious. He opened by lighting a candle, sharing his journey from factory worker to movement builder. He quoted Elon carefully, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough, not to boast, but to reassure." That night, they shared stories, laughter, tears, and the Foundation's first official spark was lit. Meanwhile, Susan helped roll out digital tools so remote communities could host virtual Spark nights. A team in Norway used them to connect elder storytellers with schoolchildren across the globe. A translator in Mexico shared his translation of the Spark Guide for a village center. Frank's movement was becoming as limitless as imagination. But then, just as momentum peaked, funding hiccups surfaced. A corporate donor pulled back. A regional partner shifted priorities. Frank felt the familiar cool fingers of doubt creep in again. He held on to a quote that had grounded him before. "The first step is to establish that something is possible, then probability will occur." Possibility was already proven, now he needed tenacity to sustain probability. Driven by that resolve, he wrote to Elon Musk, not for mentorship, but to share the Foundation's story, to say thank you for the spark that started it all. Then, quietly, he turned to his team. Susan, Harold, Melly, and others rallied. They reached out to smaller donors, applied for community grants, and extended the volunteer network. Slow but steady, funding returned. The Foundation survived. Spring arrived, and with it came the first Spark Caravan, Frank and a small team traveling to underserved towns, hosting pop-up Spark nights in recreation centers, churches, and school halls. Every night, he lit that candle. Faces glowed in the soft light. The stories came alive, dreams rekindled, connections renewed, faith restored. At each candle passing, Frank didn't just see himself, he saw Mary's hope, Susan's openness, Harold's new smile, and countless others' rediscovered voices. At a final event in Detroit, community leaders, volunteers, and Spark Night hosts gathered. Frank looked around, felt the humble gravity of the moment. He spoke not as a man with answers, but as one guided by questions. "If you're hearing your own voice in someone else's story tonight," he said, "then this movement is real, not because of me, but because of you." Back home, Frank pinned new photos to the garage wall, images from towns far and wide, faces lit by candlelight, stories in motion. He looked at the path behind him, from the moment a robot's revelation sparked a crisis, to the garage revolution of the Spark Foundation, to now. The future felt vast again. And then he wrote one final entry for the night: "The dream didn't stay small. It doesn't have to. When you dare the flame to fly, you carry everyone with you." Frank hadn't planned for the Spark Foundation to become more than a spark. He'd hoped his words and gatherings might patch a few broken spirits, maybe help a handful of lost souls remember how to dream again. Yet here he was, just days after launching the first Spark Caravan and seeing communities ignite across the map, feeling pulled deeper into something that had become a calling. But even movements need hearts to anchor them, and for that, Frank realized he didn't just need stories, he needed anchors of the heart. He sat at his desk late one night, the glow of a single lamp illuminating letters from people around the world asking for help building Spark nights in schools, nursing homes, cities, and rural towns. At the center of his corkboard was still Elon's letter, a constant reminder of how far he'd traveled. He thought of Mary, her quiet faith that dreams didn't expire, Susan's growing belief in him, Harold's return, and the strangers who found voice again. These were his anchors, the human ties that held him steady when doubt crept in again. A few days later, the foundation received a large care package from a retiree arts council in Vermont, handcrafted wooden anchors, each inscribed with a name: hope, belief, courage, start again. They were to be handed out at Spark Nights to root participants in something deeper than fear. Frank knew those anchors would be more than symbolic, they'd be lifelines. He drove through dawn-lit country roads to deliver the first batch at a Spark Night in a lakeside elder center. The room smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood. He placed frames with the handmade anchors on the tables, positioning one at each seat before participants arrived. When people came in, they paused, curious. Frank started the evening by lighting a candle and saying, "Tonight, each of these anchors is for you, not to weigh you down, but to remind you what keeps you hopeful when storms come." A woman named Ruth picked up the anchor labeled "Courage" and held it like a lifeline. "I thought I was too old to feel brave," she whispered. The anchor trembled in her hand. In the weeks that followed, Spark Nights began to include these anchors. People held them while sharing their fears and dreams, pressing them close when the words got too heavy. A former schoolteacher in Boise held the anchor marked "Belief" as she recounted how she'd always wanted to write a children's book but never tried. Now, she had a manuscript underway. A Vietnam veteran in Cleveland clutched hope and said, "I thought my best days were behind me, this anchor feels like welcome home." Back in the garage, Frank carefully recorded stories alongside each anchor's journey: who held it, what they shared, what changed. He realized something vital: transformation needed roots before it could soar. Anchors didn't limit movement, they made it possible. Sparks needed to land on something strong to help others stand again. One evening, the foundation received a message from a rural senior center in Montana. Their heater had failed, but thanks to a volunteer's fireplace, they could still host a Spark Night. The anchor labeled "Resilience" was passed from person to person in candlelight, laughter and tears mingling as snow fell outside. When the lights flickered, someone joked, "At least we have hope." Frank stared at the screen, the word echoing like warmth in his own chest. Meanwhile, Susan shared that the foundation had been invited to collaborate with a university's gerontology program. They wanted to study whether giving seniors an emotional anchor, like those handmade pieces, could measurably improve well-being. Frank felt a mix of nerves and pride. From a typewriter in an Ohio attic to clinical research about aging and purpose, it was beyond anything he'd imagined. But with growth came pressure. More regions wanted anchors, funding was stretched thin, and moments of overwhelm flared up again. At 3 a.m., Frank found himself pouring coffee and staring at his own anchor, one he'd made for himself in his garage, labeled simply "Belonging." He realized, his own anchor needed tending. He had shown up for so many yet sometimes felt unmoored in his own journey. The following morning, in a quiet phone call with Susan, he admitted the weariness. She didn't gasp or overreact. She just said, "Dad, you're not just giving anchors to others. You need them too. Ask us to be yours." Frank exhaled, tears catching him off guard. That night, for the first time, he asked his team to gift him a personal anchor, a gesture they'd given to others. They sent him a small wooden anchor inscribed with "Carry On." It arrived tied with twine and encouragement: "You belong, Frank. You always did." The anchor became part of his routine. He held it during tough decisions, during stories that got heavy, during moments when the scale of what he'd started felt too large. It grounded him. Made him real again. One afternoon, Frank was invited to speak at a national aging summit. He sat before an audience of social workers, policymakers, and seniors, and told his story, not as a success, but as a human journey anchored by love, loss, courage, and belief. He shared the concept of the emotional anchor, how sometimes a simple object, a word carved into wood, could remind us of who we are when we're afraid we've forgotten. After the talk, an older woman came forward. She had flown in from California to meet him. She pulled an anchor from her purse, the word love. She told him she'd carried it to her husband's grave to remind herself she was still alive, still worthy. "Your idea saved me," she said. Frank felt his own eyes tear. Maybe he hadn't saved the whole world, but he had saved someone. And that made every weary step worth it. That night, in his garage, Frank gently etched the word anchor into his journal, not a story of rise or movement, but one of staying grounded, of knowing when to hold on, when to spark, and when to rest. He closed the journal and placed his own carry-on anchor next to the letter from Elon, among the notes and photos. It belonged there, not on display, but intimate, real, and steady. Because while sparks ignite, anchors endure. And together, they make stories worth telling, and living. The winds of change are subtle at first, like embers carried on a soft breeze, warm, promising, almost imperceptible. Months passed since the spark foundation took shape, the anchors were out in the world, stories were spreading, and Frank felt the weight of steady growth. But even embers need tending, new fires had to be kindled, and old ones stoked. It was time for the fires that burn on, not the fireworks, but the steady flames that light a path long after the sparks fly. Frank woke one morning to a letter postmarked from a correctional facility in Georgia. He almost didn't open it, it felt too small, too bleak compared to the headlines, the summit invitations, the prototypes. But something tugged at him, and he pulled the letter out and read the scrawl, "We lit our spark night here last week. You'd be surprised. It became bearable. Thank you." Frank stared at the words, empathy etching itself into his chest. He realized that the spark wasn't limited to senior centers or bookstores. It was universal, wherever hearts felt forgotten, the spark could land and catch. He wrote back, gently, offering guidance for adapting spark nights to difficult spaces, places where systems were failing or hope was fragile. He spoke not with pity, but with belief, "You matter. Your story matters." Within weeks, he received a video. In a dimly lit common room, inmates, young and old, passed a candle in silence, then spoke. A man spoke of writing letters to his children for the first time. A woman spoke of books she never thought she'd touch again. The candle's glow illuminated faces burdened with regret, and still, they spoke. The screen flickered, and Frank felt his own tears come, quietly, in the dark. That day, he posted, "The spark doesn't know where it lands. Sometimes, it lands in the darkest places, and that's where we need it most." Emails came, not calls for designing foundations, but for small sparks in hard places, refugee centers, women's shelters, hospitals, and youth groups. A social worker in Detroit asked if there was a way to adapt the anchors into bracelets or cards they could hand out. A volunteer in rural Appalachia asked if an audio version of the Spark Guide could reach the homebound. Frank realized this was the moment the movement needed to stop impressing and start listening. He convened a virtual Spark Council of volunteers from diverse communities, teachers, activists, caregivers, former inmates, artists, young and old. They met on a video call late one evening, their faces in pinprick windows on his laptop screen, each carrying their own spark. Frank listened. One woman spoke of hosting a spark night in a pediatric oncology ward, with stuffed animals and coloring books and quiet hope. One man in a homeless shelter talked about giving out spark cards, little notes with "You Still Matter" on them, handwritten, to light moments of connection. A college student in India spoke of translating the Spark Guide into 4 regional languages. A Navajo elder spoke of using the message to teach youth to value roots and story in a world urging them to leave home. Frank felt overwhelmed, not by responsibility, but by belonging. The spark had multiplied in ways he had never envisioned. They drafted adaptations, the spark card with response prompts, a braided anchor keychain for hands that couldn't hold a wooden token, an audio meditation of stories and hope for hospital rooms. Design sketches followed, and then prototypes, candle kits for kids, pocket-sized anchors, audio files, braille cards for visually impaired seniors. The ripple had gone global, expansive, inclusive. And by leaning in, listening, and letting others lead, the spark would continue to burn long after Frank was gone. But even part of a revolution needs rest. Frank noticed the slows in his own heartbeat. He stumbled on words. He missed calls. Some he'd been meaning to make for months. When Susan Skyped him one evening, her face full of concern, he admitted the exhaustion. His throat closed as he whispered, "I'm afraid the next fire will burn out, if I'm not careful." She reached across the screen and said, "We've got anchors everywhere. Let us anchor you, Dad." He accepted. That weekend, he closed his laptop and sat in silence, a rare, sacred act. No planning. No posts. Just presence. Hours passed. Outside his window, spring rain fell softly. He held the carry-on anchor in one hand, a lit candle in another, and simply breathed. He thought of the faces he'd seen, of words he'd written, of stories he'd held. He allowed himself to feel the slow healing of rest, the strength that grew in stillness. The fires that burn on don't roar constantly, they breathe, they steady, they draw strength from quiet hearths as much as from kindling. Days later, Frank emerged from rest with renewed clarity. He framed the Spark Council's plans into a formal adaptive Spark program, tools and guides for vulnerable communities, digitally and physically accessible, hands-on but minimally resourced. A local trust granted funds to build Spark kits for 3 pilot sites, a jail, a children's hospital wing, and a mental health center. Frank packed the first kits himself, folded guides, candles, anchors, wooden or braided, cards, audio pens. Susan helped load the car. They drove to deliver them. In the hospital's pediatric wing, a nurse invited Frank to walk into a mural-lit room. A child whispered into the microphone on the Spark pen, "I want to be brave," and the pen recorded it. The anchor keychain fit small hands. And when the candle was lit, tiny faces brightened. It felt like sunrise. In the jail, a guard unlocked a quiet meeting room. Families visited. Conversations started. In the mental health center, therapists and patients sat with the anchors and cards, and the room felt rooted in humanity again. Frank watched from the back, heart full. The spark had sparked sparks. Not because of him, but because they dared it to. That evening, he wrote in his journal, "We started with fear, but the spark outgrew the story. Now we kindle what we can, where we are. The fire that lasts is not the blinding one, but the one that glows long, even in darkness." He dubbed the adaptation, "The Fires That Burn On." At the next council meeting, a young woman from South Africa said, "Frank, I was afraid this would be something sentimental. But it's not, I see purpose, strategy, and healing all in one flame." The council smiled. This was purpose made manifest. Months later, at Spark Summit, held virtually and physically, a tattooed man in his 30s, a head nurse in her 60s, a refugee student from Syria, a tribal elder from the Amazon. All held anchors and spoke of how the spark reached them. Frank listened with steady calm. He realized the spark had become a fire spreading not because he lit it, but because others carried it with courage, anchored in their hearts. That night, alone, Frank lit a candle in the garage. The letter from Elon, the anchors, the maps, the noise faded. The flame burned steady. He whispered, "Let it burn on." And in that room, in that small Ohio garage turned sanctuary for hope, he felt the true fire had just begun. Frank stood at the edge of the Spark Foundation's annual summit, gazing out at a sea of faces, bright, curious, weathered, hopeful, across the grand hall, anchored by candles flickering in every hand. These were the voices of tomorrow, echoing today, and Frank realized how far he'd traveled from that day he watched Elon Musk unveil the robot, feeling invisible, obsolete, adrift. Now he watched possibility, humanity's capacity to begin again. Reflected back at him from hundreds of souls. The opening keynote was humbly brief. Frank didn't rehearse inside joke lines or soaring visionary tropes. He simply said, "You are the echoes of tomorrow." He described how the spark he lit so many months ago had become a chorus, stories from around the world, from a child whispering, "I want to be brave," to Harold's reclaimed friendship, to a refugee student learning English through storytelling. The spark isn't mine, it belongs to every hand that chose to light it and every heart that carried it forward. He told them of Elon Musk's words that had first ignited his journey. The phrase that echoed stronger now than ever, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank admitted how those words had terrified him at first, whispering, maybe failure was coming, maybe this was all going to fall apart. But then he recognized that embracing failure wasn't defeat, it was courage to try again. He told the audience, "Each spark night that doesn't go perfectly, each anchor that doesn't land like we hope, it teaches us something. Failure isn't a stop sign. It's a compass." And the room hummed in resonance. He spoke of, "The first step is to establish that something is possible, then probability will occur." Frank said, "At first, I didn't know how to write or start a blog or lead a movement. But I believed that reinvention was possible, and little by little, it became probable." He invited them to name what seemed impossible in their lives right now. And believe, if enough of them carried that spark, they could make it probable too. In the crowd, Susan passed out small cards, tiny versions of the Spark Guide, written in Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and American Sign Language icons, a symbol of inclusivity that had grown organically over the months. Frank invited a participant from Mexico to the front, who read a line in Spanish, "Nunca es demasiado tarde para encender de nuevo, it's never too late to ignite again." The hall erupted in quiet applause, a moment of hope translated by humanity itself. Then came the stories, people stepping forward to share how they had carried the spark into tomorrow. A young teacher from Detroit spoke of bringing spark nights into her classroom. Students who only spoke Swahili found words in English, and over time, the anchor labeled "belonging" began to feel not just like a token but identity. A former coal miner in Kentucky held a handcrafted anchor marked "Reclaim," telling how he'd reconnected with his son through weekly storytelling, after years of silence. A refugee in Italy, and a man in his 70s, shared how she found a second home at a spark night. These tales echoed in Frank's mind as proof, the spark had left its mark. Frank paused between them, letting each voice resonate. There was fear, yes, but there was also belonging. There was invisibility, yes, but also presence. At the close, he invited everyone to stand, hand a candle to one another, and say, "Not yet." The word first kits himself, folded guides, candles, anchors, wooden or braided, cards, audio pens. Susan helped load the car. They drove to deliver them. In the hospital's pediatric wing, a nurse invited Frank to walk into a mural-lit room. A child whispered into the microphone on the Spark pen, "I want to be brave," and the pen recorded it. The anchor keychain fit small hands. And when the candle was lit, tiny faces brightened. After the summit, Frank sat silently in a quiet corner, candlelight flickering shadows across the walls lined with anchors, letters, and photos of gatherings. He thought about Elon Musk's approach to change. "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." That line caught him. They hadn't just embraced change, they were change. The spark would refuse to cower, to settle, to vanish. It would echo into the tomorrows of tomorrow. He wrote in his journal by candlelight, "I'm not the spark. I'm a keeper of fire. And the echoes I hear, they're not mine alone. They're tomorrow's heartbeat." He closed the journal and looked out the hall window at a horizon lit by dawn, knowing the fire would keep burning, soft, steady, relentless through all the nights ahead. Frank had never imagined the path of reinvention would lead him here, to standing on a narrow bridge between what was and what could be. The Spark Foundation was no longer just his story or his spark, it had become a lifeline stretching across generations, geography, and circumstance. But bridges require balance, and he found himself facing a new kind of challenge: how to connect the past with the future, the old self with the new, the familiar fears with unfamiliar hopes. This was the bridge to new beginnings, and crossing it demanded courage he was still learning to summon. It began with a letter from a woman named Helen, a retired nurse living alone in a small town in Iowa. She wrote of how she had come to a spark night in her community center, reluctant at first, carrying decades of doubt and loneliness. But when she held the anchor labeled "Renewal," something stirred in her. She began writing poetry again after 40 years, sharing verses with others who had long given up their dreams. Her words spoke of loss but also of light, and through her poems, Helen found a voice that bridged her past regrets with a future she dared to imagine. Frank held her letter close. Helen's journey was a mirror of so many he'd met, people balancing grief and hope, past and future. Frank realized the foundation needed more than programs, it needed rituals, simple, meaningful ways for people to mark transitions. So he gathered his team and together they designed bridge ceremonies, moments where participants could honor their past, release old fears, and step boldly into possibility. The ceremonies included lighting a candle, speaking aloud a regret or a hope, and physically crossing a small wooden bridge crafted to symbolize the journey. These bridges were portable, handcrafted by volunteers with wood from local forests, painted with colors that symbolized renewal. The first bridge ceremony was held at a spark night in rural Tennessee. Frank watched as a man named James, once a steelworker who had lost his job to automation, stood hesitant at the foot of the small bridge. James carried years of bitterness and doubt, convinced that reinvention was for others, not him. But when he placed one foot on the bridge, lighting his candle, and spoke his hope aloud, Frank saw something shift. The fire in James's eyes wasn't just from the candle, it was a spark of possibility. He crossed the bridge slowly, and when he reached the other side, he smiled for the first time in years. News of the bridge ceremonies spread quickly, becoming a symbol for communities struggling with change, loss, and the unknown. A school in New Mexico invited Frank to lead a ceremony for their graduating seniors, young people facing an uncertain future with the weight of family history on their shoulders. The bridge became a metaphor for their lives. A place to honor their roots but also to step forward with courage. The ceremony was raw and powerful, tears and laughter mingled as parents and students crossed together, carrying anchors that symbolized their shared journey. Back home, Frank's own bridge was not without cracks. The foundation's growth brought new demands, funding pressures, scaling challenges, and the quiet exhaustion that shadowed his days. Late one night, sitting in his garage surrounded by anchors and letters, he questioned whether he was truly crossing toward new beginnings or merely balancing on old fears disguised as hope. The words Elon Musk had once shared came back to him: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank realized the bridge wasn't perfect, and neither was he. But importance, not perfection, was what carried him forward. Susan noticed the weariness in her father's eyes and suggested he take a trip she had planned. A retreat to the Oregon coast, a place where sea and sky met in endless horizons. Frank hesitated but agreed. The ocean's vastness was both humbling and healing. Walking along the shoreline, Frank let the waves wash over his feet and the wind clear his mind. He thought about the bridges he'd helped others cross and how often the greatest crossing was the one within himself, from doubt to trust, from fear to action. During that retreat, Frank met an artist named Lila, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and bright eyes that held stories of many seasons. Lila told Frank about her own journey of reinvention, how after losing her husband and decades of teaching, she had found new purpose through painting. Her art was a bridge between past and present, grief and joy. She showed Frank a painting of a bridge over a river, its colors shifting from stormy gray to golden dawn. "We're all crossing our own bridges," Lila said softly. "The key is to keep moving, even when the path isn't clear." Inspired by Lila's words, Frank returned home with renewed resolve. He knew the foundation's next step was to build more than ceremonies, it was to create spaces, physical and emotional, that could serve as communal bridges. Spaces where people could gather, share stories, create art, and support each other's journeys. He began working with architects and community leaders to design spark houses. Welcoming centers that combined workshops, galleries, and quiet rooms for reflection. Each spark house would host bridge ceremonies and offer ongoing programs for connection and growth. Months passed as plans took shape, funding was secured, and the first spark house was built in Frank's hometown, a modest but warm building nestled between old maples, its walls adorned with murals created by community members. The grand opening was filled with laughter, music, and tears. Helen read a new poem she had written about bridges, James shared how he had found work mentoring others, and Susan unveiled a gallery of art inspired by reinvention. Frank watched, heart full, as people crossed a real wooden bridge set up for the ceremony, a symbol and a promise. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant hues over the spark house, Frank sat quietly, reflecting on the journey. He thought about Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of the impossible, the robot unveiling that had sparked his own transformation, and the countless lives touched by the foundation. He understood now that reinvention was not a destination but a bridge, one built on hope, anchored by community, and crossed one step at a time. Frank whispered to himself, "We are all bridges to new beginnings." And with that, he looked ahead, ready for whatever crossings awaited. Frank sat quietly in the old armchair by the window, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the world moved on, cars rushing, children laughing, birds flying, but inside, time felt both heavy and light. The foundation was thriving, the spark houses were opening in towns and cities, the bridge ceremonies becoming rituals of healing. Yet beneath the success lay a quiet question that Frank couldn't shake: what came after the bridge? What lay beyond the visible horizon of change? For years, Frank had believed transformation was a series of steps: spark, build, cross. But now he sensed that the true journey was less linear, more mysterious. There was an unseen horizon, a place where reinvention transcended actions and became a deeper way of being. It was a horizon he glimpsed in moments: the smile of a woman finding joy after loss, the steady hand of a man learning to forgive, the laughter of children who once felt invisible. But it was also a horizon he feared, because it demanded surrender, to uncertainty, to loss, to a future not yet shaped. One evening, after a long day at the Spark House, Frank found a letter slipped under the door. The handwriting was unfamiliar but steady, elegant. Inside, a note read, "Sometimes the greatest leaps come when we step into the unseen. Trust the horizon waiting for you." No signature. Just those words, simple and cryptic, like a whisper from the universe. Frank turned the note over again and again. Who had sent it? A stranger? A friend? A messenger? He felt both unsettled and intrigued. That night, sleep eluded him. His mind wandered through memories, the fears of aging, the doubts that had shadowed his first steps, the courage that had sparked the foundation. He realized that despite all the bridges built and fires kindled, he had never truly faced the unseen horizon within himself. The next morning, Frank decided to seek answers in silence. He retreated to a quiet cabin in the woods, far from schedules and screens. There, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of nature, he began a daily practice of sitting still, listening to the rhythms of his breath, the sounds of the forest. At first, restlessness crept in. His mind raced with unfinished plans, worries about the foundation's future, fears of becoming irrelevant. But gradually, the noise softened. He felt a strange peace, a space where questions could live without immediate answers. One afternoon, as he sat watching the light filter through leaves, a memory surfaced, his father's voice, steady and gentle, saying, "Life is about seeing what's beyond the next hill, even when you can't yet walk there." That image stirred something deep. Frank understood that the unseen horizon wasn't a place on a map but a call to trust the unknown, to embrace mystery as part of growth. It was a surrender to faith, not in certainty, but in possibility. Returning from the woods, Frank brought this insight to the Foundation's leadership meeting. He spoke openly about the need to embrace uncertainty and to prepare the community for a future that could not be fully predicted. Some were uncomfortable, craving plans and metrics. Others felt inspired. Together, they began to explore ways to cultivate resilience, not just in projects, but in hearts. They developed programs focused on mindfulness, storytelling, and emotional courage, helping people live fully in the unknown spaces between what was and what could be. Frank's own life reflected this shift. He began to let go of controlling every detail and opened himself to moments of spontaneity, walking unplanned trails, striking up conversations with strangers, accepting invitations he might once have declined. He found joy in small surprises, in the unpredictability of daily life. The foundation thrived on this new energy, fueled by flexibility and trust. One afternoon, at a Spark House in Portland, Frank met a young woman named Maya. She was a poet and a healer, with an easy smile and eyes that seemed to see beyond surface pain. Maya shared her story of surviving illness and finding purpose in helping others face the unknown with grace. She spoke of the horizon as a metaphor for hope, a promise that even in darkness, light waits to be found. Frank felt an immediate connection and invited her to join the Foundation's advisory council. Together, they launched the Horizon Project, a series of gatherings where people shared stories of uncertainty and hope. These gatherings became sacred spaces, safe harbors where vulnerability was met with compassion, and where the unseen horizon was honored as a place of collective dreaming and courage. Stories poured out, of career reinvention after loss, of late-life love found, of families healing wounds long thought permanent. The horizon became less a distant goal and more a living presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Frank stood on the rooftop of a Spark House, looking out at the fading light. The wind was cool, the air electric with possibility. He felt a profound gratitude, for the journey, for the people who carried the spark, for the mysteries yet to come. He whispered a prayer of thanks and release, knowing that the unseen horizon was not something to fear, but to embrace. As the stars began to appear, Frank understood that the horizon would always be just out of reach, inviting him, and all of them, to keep moving forward with open hearts. The true transformation, he realized, was not in crossing bridges or lighting fires alone, but in living fully in the mystery of what comes next. The horizon was the promise of forever becoming, and that promise was enough. Frank awoke before sunrise, the soft glow of dawn brushing through the window like a whispered promise. Today was different, a culmination of years marked by quiet courage, hesitant steps, and an unyielding refusal to fade away. The foundation had grown beyond his wildest dreams, bridges spanned across countless lives, and the horizon he had once feared now shone clearly with possibility. But the real dawn wasn't outside, it was inside him, glowing steady after the long night of doubt. He dressed slowly, savoring the morning calm, and stepped outside into the crisp air. The neighborhood was still, the familiar streets bathed in the soft light of early morning. As he walked toward the Spark House, birds began their songs, notes of hope, renewal, and the simple beauty of beginning again. Frank felt the pulse of life all around him, and in that moment, he understood, the new dawn wasn't just a metaphor. It was a living, breathing truth. At the Spark House, the staff were already bustling, preparing for the Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration. Volunteers hung banners, arranged flowers, and set up tables filled with photographs, letters, and anchors, symbols of transformation carried from countless hands and hearts. Frank paused, letting the scene wash over him. This place, once just a spark in his mind, was now a beacon for so many. The celebration began with a bridge ceremony, led by Susan, whose youthful energy had become a steady force in the Foundation's journey. She invited everyone to light candles, share hopes, and cross the wooden bridge set up at the center of the room, a ritual that had become a sacred act of commitment and courage. Frank watched tears and smiles mingle as people crossed, some alone, some hand in hand, each step a testament to resilience. Then Frank took the stage, the weight of the moment settling like a warm cloak around his shoulders. He spoke from the heart, his voice steady but tender. 5 years ago, I stood where many of you are now, unsure if I still mattered, if change was possible, if my story could have a new chapter. I found a spark in unexpected places, in words from a man I'd never met, Elon Musk, whose courage to fail inspired me to try. But the real power came from you, all of you who chose to believe, to build, to cross your own bridges. This new dawn is ours, together. He shared stories, of Helen and her poetry, James and his mentorship, Maya and the Horizon Project, all threads woven into a tapestry of transformation. The room hummed with connection, a living mosaic of hope and action. Frank invited everyone to write a letter to their future selves, a ritual of reflection and intention that would be collected and opened at the next anniversary. He smiled as he wrote his own, words of encouragement, grace, and a reminder: keep crossing, keep trusting, keep becoming. After the formal program, the room opened to laughter, music, and shared meals. Frank moved through the crowd, embracing friends old and new, feeling the richness of community. A young woman approached, her eyes bright with tears. "Your story saved me," she said softly. "I thought I was too old to start over. But you showed me that the spark never dies." Frank felt the familiar warmth of hope, the fire he had ignited now burning fiercely in others. As night fell, the celebration moved outside, where a bonfire blazed under the stars. Frank stood with Susan and Maya, watching flames dance and hearing stories carried on the wind. The fire reminded him of the first spark, small, uncertain, yet persistent enough to grow. They spoke of the future, of plans to expand the spark houses, deepen the bridge ceremonies, and continue nurturing the unseen horizon within every soul. Later, alone beneath the vast night sky, Frank reflected on his journey, the fear, the failures, the breakthroughs. He realized the new dawn was not an arrival but a continuous unfolding, an invitation to live with curiosity and courage every day. Elon Musk's words echoed gently: persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Frank whispered a vow to himself, to keep pushing, to keep believing, to keep lighting sparks in the hearts of those who felt forgotten. He looked up at the stars, feeling a deep peace. The journey was far from over, but the new dawn was here, a dawn born from the courage to change, the power of community, and the endless possibility of reinvention. Frank smiled, knowing that no matter what came next, he would face it with an open heart and a spirit unbroken. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?